Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The 3-decade rule of Sudan's President Bashir came to an end in 2019 in what seemed like a rebooted Arab Spring led by youth and women. The protest movement led senior military officials to remove Bashir in a coup, resembling the events of Egypt in 2011. But protesters continued to demand the military's removal from politics, and some were massacred that year. This was followed by a charter creating a transitional coalition government composed of civilians and the military. In 2020, the Trump administration blackmailed Sudan into recognizing Israel in exchange for removing it from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. This led to a reduction of sanctions and improved economic ties with the international community. The military continued to obstruct a transition and then staged a coup in October of 2021, but was surprised by the popular opposition. They placed the prime minister under house arrest and arrested many civilian leaders. Under international pressure, the military restored the prime minister, but it was recognized as a sham, and protests continued until he resigned in January of this year. In fact, protests continue today. Sudan is suffering from an economic disaster, decades of authoritarian rule, and foreign intervention from countries in the region and the West. So how did we get here, and where are we going? To understand, I'm joined by Magdi El Gizouli, a Sudanese academic and fellow of the Rift Valley Institute, as well as a frequent commentator and writer on Sudanese affairs on his blog, Still Sudan. Magdi, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I guess let's just get right into it. You no doubt know that Sudan is even less known, I think, or understood to Westerners than perhaps other countries in the Middle East. And the protest movement came as a surprise, I think, to all of us. So can you maybe give a quick summary to our audience of the events from 2019 to the present, the uprising, the removal of Bashir, the coup, and where things stand today?
I'll try to do that. But I think the best part of your introduction that I really appreciated is when you said that the US effectively blackmailed Sudan to signing a deal with Israel, which was made the condition for Sudan's re-entry into the international arena in a way. And it was a condition, and it was a blackmail. Had the international community, including the US, any serious interest in bringing Sudan out of its sort of multiple and complex crisis, that would have cost something, in the words of the former Minister of Finance, who assumed the post after the toppling of President Bashir, would have cost something in the range of $12 billion. That would be Sudan's bailout price from the severe crisis it's stuck in. And that price proved to be a bit too much for the Western world. So what they wanted instead is they took money from Sudan instead of paying money for Sudan. Sudan was forced to settle cases in US courts out of court with hefty payments in the millions of US dollars that was effectively taken out of people's mouths. That is at a moment of severe crisis. Now, in my mind, Sudan's history can best be understood through the commodities it exports. Sudan began its life as a modern nation with the export of cotton, which was produced from the central rainlands of Sudan. And this sustained Sudan for a long time, until probably the early 80s, when a financial crisis that hit many parts of the world also hit Sudan at the end of the 70s. And Sudan was plunged in deep debt. It didn't really come out of that deep debt crisis until 2002 or 3. At that time, Sudan was a producer of oil, and oil replaced cotton as in many ways, the bloodline of the country and the lifeline of how the country works. It was a lifeline for people in the heartland of the country. It was a trail of tears and blood for people where oil was produced in southern Sudan. The conflict over southern Sudan ended in the secession of southern Sudan in 2011, and this plunged Sudan into its second major financial crisis. The first being in the 70s, in the late 70s, the second being after the secession of South Sudan, when Sudan lost oil. And with that, it lost essentially all of its foreign income. And A country like Sudan, like many other countries, is heavily dependent on foreign currency returns, but because it produces very little in terms of manufactured goods, or effectively no manufactured goods. And it depends on its medicines, on a good chunk of its food also, because of the changes in people's diets and their reliance on wheat. It depends on imports. To finance these imports, you need US dollars. To get US dollars, you need to export something to the outside world. And that something was, for some time, oil. And this oil made Sudan a middle income country. But it also made it a very troublesome country where people fought long wars for the state, because it was the state was the only sort of mechanism through which you could control the oil industry. And indeed, that long war ended in secession. And when it happened, the two countries that emerged out of that process were both poorer in a way. South Sudan was plunged in a chronic and still continuing civil war, and Sudan was plunged into the current crisis that included also civil wars in its new peripheries, places that were once upon a time sort of in the center of the country. Now, because of the secession of South Sudan, they became its southern border. This also included a war that is famous in the US, the Darfur War, which people in the US might know better than many of Sudan's other chronic wars. And these wars were exacerbated by the production of oil, and they became even more intense after oil was lost. And it was clear that the central government was getting weaker, was becoming weaker. And there was a way to topple it if you try hard enough. And that way was arguably rural insurrection, sort of wars fought out in the countryside. Now, these wars did not bring down President Bashir's government. For one good reason is that he had a good insurance against rural war, which is the rural militia. So he, in a way, he invented a way of governing that is not only true for Sudan, but also true for other places around the world. Places like Yemen or Afghanistan or Congo are all somehow caught in this government by militia logic. And myself and a co-author of mine, we are working together on a book, Edward Thomas. We think that President Bashir is in many ways the progenitor of this way of governance. And it has a history in Sudan that I won't develop right now. But he created a militia, a large militia. And through this militia, he could suppress insurgency in rural Sudan, in places like Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile. This militia became, in a way, his security, his insurance against coups, against also protest movement in the heartland. And indeed, in 2013, after Sudan lost that oil and became a poorer country for that, President Bashir faced a financial crisis. He was not able anymore to finance cheap bread in places like Khartoum and other cities in the central heartland of the country or in the urban centers of the country. And cheap bread was, like in Egypt, was the basis of the social contract. The social contract relied on providing cheap bread for the city. And in Sudan, also cheap fuel. And that happened through subsidies, through subsidizing bread, wheat, imported wheat, and subsidizing fuel, part of which was imported too. So when he faced that financial crisis, the ruling party at the time started thinking about cutting down these expenses. And they did that in 2013 in one step. This precipitated a large protest movement in the city. And the response was to send snipers on the street. So he brought in that militia he had used to quell rural insurgency. He brought it into the city. And he ordered the militia to shoot people. And indeed they did. Scores of young women and men were killed. And this was, in a way, the triage of the 2018-2019 revolution. This was the first wave of that movement. And in between, there was a long lull where people, the established political parties, didn't have an idea where to go. The new protest movement was examining itself, sort of experimenting with organizational forms. And it came up with a very Sudanese invention, that is called the Resistance Committee, which in a way is a gang of young women and men, mostly men, of course, who decide to operate against the police force. In many times, they're not politically that mature, or mature is not maybe the right word. They're not politically that informed, but they know who the enemy is. And the best thing about these resistance committees is that they emerged at the neighborhood level. They did not emerge on campus. They emerged where people lived, which meant that new alliances could be created between radical students, who were in many cases at the forefront of these committees, and between people who constitute the largest section of the labor force in Sudan, like in many other countries in the region, informal labor, people who make bricks or who fix fences or who to build walls or who are involved in petty trade, people who make a living day by day. And this was the heart of the protest. In many ways, this was the major strength of the protest movement that brought down President Bashir in 2019. At the heart of that was this alliance between radical students, people who had campus experience, who could use language to sort of express their political anger, and people who voted in a way with their feet, who expressed their anger by marching, long marches, and attacking headquarters of the ruling party, signs of government, including places like the Zakat chamber, which is an alms office, form of Islamic alms. And people had a sort of a long-standing anger against the Zakat chamber because they thought it was taking their money and not giving it back in any substantive way to the poor or to the needy. And the security services, of course, and police.
So that's actually, so I'm glad that you raised that point, because I'm curious, why did the military get involved in overthrowing Omar Bashir? What are their interests specifically?
That's a very good question, especially that you raise it in that way. Why did the military get involved? The military got involved because they needed to shortcut this transformation. They needed to be at the right place at the right time. If they had let this wave move on, it would probably have radicalized further. The demands would have been a bit more unstoppable. And it was a way of short-circuiting a revolution, if you like. In a way, the start of the restoration, the start of the counter-revolution, was this coup d'etat that happened in April 2019, when the military pushed away Omar al-Bashir. The people who took over power were, in essence, his captains. The leader of that militia I talked to you about became the second man. A major officer in the army who was under Bashir, the inspector general of the army, became the top man. Other senior figures in the army occupied major positions in the Sovereignty Council, which was effectively the presidency, a sort of collegial presidency led by members of the army. Now, obviously, they did something that had also a history in Sudan's earlier histories of revolution, and we in the history books written by Sudanese, it's called the coup d'etat of the commander-in-chief. It's when the commander-in-chief sort of takes on the job of removing the government. And it happened twice in Sudan's record. It happened first in in 1958, when the commander-in-chief pushed away an elected prime minister who demanded to be pushed away. It was sort of a coup, a conspiracy in the palace. And the second time it happened in 1985, when there was also such a broad protest movement against President Nimeri. And the second in command, who was the chief of the army, pushed the president away from his seat and took his position. So it's a way of ensuring the security services and the military and the coercive apparatus of the state against the anger of a wide and broad protest movement.
That makes perfect sense. And in terms of what happened last year with the military then once again trying to overthrow the prime minister, that was another coup attempt. The U.S. appeared to oppose the coup, but it refused to call it a coup, which actually kind of reminded me of Sisi's coup in Egypt in 2013. But we're used to the U.S. having a major role in these kinds of events. But in this case, it does seem that lately the US has taken a bit more of a back seat, and players like, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Turks, the Israelis, and others regionally are playing a larger role. So can you explain, how important was the foreign role in events in Sudan since 2019?
Well, I think it was very, very important because before this year, 2018, 2019, if you want to understand where a coup originates in Sudan, you need to make a telephone call with Cairo. If you want to work out who's doing what, let me
Right.
explain this better. The Sudanese army is in many ways an Egyptian creation.
Mm.
The logic of the army, the way it thinks about its interests, the way it has developed is Egyptian because it was born of the Egyptian colonial experience in Sudan, if you like. And in many ways, it was the king's army, sort of the Egyptian king's army. Even the Nasser turn in the Sudanese army did not happen full throng. So in many ways, it remains attached to these traditions. And I think the ideal place where the Sudanese army would think itself, would wish itself, would in many ways be where the Egyptian army now is, in control of a state. And both of them look up to the Israeli army as probably the best example of an army that has a state, an army that controls a state. And I think that goes a long way in explaining how things happen today in Sudan. It does involve a lot of Egyptian influence. It also involves a lot of Israeli influence. And you have probably followed, or maybe some of your listeners have followed, these clandestine visits that continue to happen between Khartoum and Tel Aviv. And usually they involve primarily security officers and military men who are discussing sort of undisclosed military affairs. And when the head of the 25th October coup, the current sort of, he is effectively the president, head of the Sovereignty Council, was asked about this, he said, "Oh, there is nothing to hide. There are only security matters that we are discussing." So as you can see, that goes a long way in explaining who moves sort of the chess pieces in Sudan today. Some of this happens directly with Israeli involvement, and some of it happens through the mediation of the Emiratis, who in many ways have financed a good chunk of the transitional period. They haven't financed everybody, they have financed their allies. And there are open access data that explain this. Almost all of Sudan's gold exports go to the United Arab Emirates. This is effectively sort of 99.9% of Sudan's gold exports. And that's one major export item that Sudan has. So gold constitutes almost a half of Sudan's export returns. And all this happens through the Dubai market. And this sort of might explain a bit how much influence a country like the UAE has on a poor country like Sudan.
Of course. And, since you moved it to the economy, I did want to ask, how important was oil in the Sudanese economy? And what was the impact when the oil ran out?
Well, it was very important. It replaced effectively all this rent-based economy, replaced Sudan's old agriculture. And it was a resource that was somehow much more amenable to control, because controlling the gold, the oil revenue, depended on controlling wells through military force, and militias were employed to do that in southern Sudan, and controlling a single pipeline. So all that was needed was a concentrated police force or a militia force that guarded the pipeline, combined, of course, with the financial capacity to work out all these receipts and export data and so on, and the dealings with the foreign companies that dug out the oil out, primarily Chinese companies. So it was something that a state bureaucracy could do very well, without being open to sort of popular questioning or popular scrutiny. And you needed a small bureaucratic force with a small, in many ways, a small military force to control a lot of money. And this was how Sudan became a middle income country between 2000 and 2011, the 10 good years of Sudan. This meant this didn't apply to everybody in Sudan, though. It applied essentially to urban centers. This financed a very big increase in consumption in Sudan. And it also meant a change, a major and drastic change in lifestyles. People were able, at least Sudan's middle classes, were able to buy more cars. You could find more than one car parked in a house. They could also afford more electricity. You could see people sort of doing more air conditioning. Sort of lifestyle in the capital changed. People were eating out more, consuming more, and they looked at places like Dubai or Doha as examples of a good life. Now, this happened at the expense of much poorer people, people in the periphery of the country, people in southern Sudan, who were controlled by an army and the militia. It also meant that very little money went to the countryside. So all that big money that was flowing into Khartoum meant that it wasn't going to places like Darfur, where infrastructure improvements would have been needed to improve productivity of the agricultural sector and keep people away from hunger. It also meant that Sudan became completely reliant on imports of wheat to feed its cities, because people were depending on that cheap wheat that was coming in from outside to eat. And in many ways, that was Bashir's present to the cities. That was his contract. I give you cheap bread, I give you cheap fuel, and otherwise you shut up and allow me to kill as many people as I want in a place like Darfur. And in many ways, that worked. And that's probably one reason for the difficulty in relations between urban revolutionaries and these former rural insurgents in today's Sudan. One reason for that deep mistrust is this unspoken contradiction at the heart of the country's politics, and many times often unspoken, between the interests of the countryside and the interests of the urban center, especially when you know that these urban centers contribute almost nothing to gross domestic product.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, Sudan did have this sort of state managed economy, right? At one point, and in the 1970s was still in that kind of developmental state. But much like, countries like Egypt or Syria, which what you just described reminds me of with Egypt and Syria, Sudan underwent this process of neoliberalism and this creation of what you mentioned, this consumption culture. So I guess, why, can you explain why did the socialist experiment in Sudan come to an end? You kind of talked about some of the consequences, but if you could elaborate.
I mean, socialist experience would be probably what people thought it might be, but I'm not sure if that's what it was. The social experience was, in many ways, monopoly purchased by state-owned companies of primary products produced in a poor countryside. That's the short version. So that meant in many instances, I mean, not in many instances, there was a state company for cotton production and manufacture that had monopoly over the purchase of cotton. As a cotton producer, you were essentially forced to sell cotton to the government company at the government determined price. And then several other companies were created to cover other sort of profitable commodities. There was a sesame production purchase company that was also state-owned. And there was, and of course, Sudan sold land in large amounts to Arab Gulf countries. That was the time, what you call a socialist strategy, I'm not you, but what many would call a socialist strategy, but is this calculation of the combination of Arab Gulf money and Sudanese land at one point. And there was a speculation at one point in the 70s, Egyptian peasants. The Egyptian peasant story didn't really materialize, so it remained Arab Gulf money or Arab Gulf capital and Sudanese agricultural land. But there was nothing socialist about it. This was the state sort of appropriating the little meager profit it could scrap out of labor of agricultural labor in Sudan's central rainlands, if you like. And they couldn't really make a lot of money out of it at the end of the day. And it plunged Sudan into the serious debt crisis it found itself in at the end of the 80s, because it had all these Arab Gulf countries to pay back to. It didn't have really much money to give, because most of these major, expansive and very ambitious agricultural projects proved a complete disaster in terms of productivity and in terms of output. Paradoxically, it is Sudan's sort of traditional agriculture that is much more productive and much more adapted to Sudan's environmental crisis, which are many, than Sudan's capitalist agriculture. And today, Sudan relies exactly on this type of agriculture to fund its state coffers. Most of the money coming into Sudan's sort of budget today is coming from sesame production in the sandy lands of Kordofan and Darfur. Most of it is produced by very traditional means that go back to 100 years or more, and animal production, which means a sort of livestock that people move around in dense prairies between desert pasture and more greener pasture in a cyclical fashion, and that has been now adapted to sort of export economy. And these are all raw products. None of this goes through any manufacturing procedure, apart maybe from cleaning gum arabic, which is also it's a forest product. It's something that you don't really, you pluck off trees at a particular season and you pack in large sacks and you export to France. The people who are making them, the real money, of course, are not the producers, are the middlemen who have the capacity to mediate between European and American markets and the primary producer in Sudan. But that's most of where the money is coming from in today's Sudan. And if you compare that with the 19th century Sudan, it's almost the same. So it's as if the entire 20th century didn't happen.
So, Middle East observers may be aware of the terrible effects of inflation in places like Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, because that tends to, we hear about inflation, or like Venezuela, that tends to dominate the news when we talk about that issue. But it's little known that inflation in Sudan reached, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, reached at least 400%, which is insane.
Yeah.
So can you explain what caused this crazy high level of inflation and how this affected people's lives?
Well, it was, I mean, I'm not an economist by training. I'm an amateur in all these matters. But to my mind, that was what some people would name a stagflation. There were inflationary pressures caused by the depreciation of the foreign currency, because the foreign currency was sustained at a price by a government sort of funded price by the Bank of Sudan. And then the post-revolution government decided to float the currency. And with floating of the currency, which meant it was available on the open market and allowed to compete against the US dollar. And there was an immediate depreciation of the value of the currency to sort of very low levels. And this meant that everything Sudan gets is imported. So the price of almost every single commodity in the country is partially or completely dependent on the price of the US dollar, which meant that all prices went up multiple times. And the critical factor in all these increasing prices was the price of fuel, which the government also decided to liberalize, which because it removed subsidies on fuel and it removed subsidies on bread. So there was in one blow a severe depreciation of the value of the currency, a massive increase in the price of fuel, a massive increase in the price of wheat, and it all meant that the prices went really to the sky, and people did not have the purchasing power to cover that. So what happened was essentially hunger. And this year, Sudan is a very hungry place. Almost every third person in the country is facing a food crisis of some sort. There are definitions of what a food crisis is that you can read off WFP books or reports, but in simple terms, the current situation in the country is every third person is not sure what she or he will eat the next day because they can't cover that. And people are depending on different coping mechanisms to cover that problem. They're borrowing money, they're asking relatives from abroad to send money, they're selling their meager means, be it a goat or a cow or house utensils in the open market to cover food costs. And of course, they're cutting on all other expenditures. They're cutting on medicines. People don't go to doctors. They rely on anybody in the neighborhood who knows how to diagnose anything by his own sort of creativity. And they're
Yeah.
relying on traditional medicine to sort of heal themselves. And of course, they are also avoiding government because they don't want to pay taxes or to pay dues. And this applies to one third of the country's population. Um, this also means, and this is something you can read off any UNICEF report, every third child in the country is stunted.
Wow.
And stunting means that you're so malnourished over a long period of time that you don't reach your normal height, your expected height. So it's not just hunger, it's chronic hunger. And the
Oh.
novelty about this hunger is that it's not only in the countryside, which where most of Sudan's historical hunger has been, it's also hunger that is happening in the cities. And this is partially responsible for the increase in crime rates in the country. Um, there is a lot of crime in a city like Khartoum. People who knew Khartoum in the 80s or even in the 90s wouldn't recognize it today. It was a very safe place to be. Somebody like yourself would even walk to the most distant neighborhood in Khartoum, the poorest of places, and nobody would ask you a question. And people would even welcome you into their houses and maybe offer you something to eat. But today it's a very unsafe place. People are worried about their own well being because there is armed robbery on the open street in main crossings, in main streets, and these are the effects of what you term neoliberalization. This is a man-made situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is true. Sudan's cereal production this year dropped by 1/5. But under better funding conditions for Sudan's farmers, they would probably be able to produce enough cereals to make everybody have sufficient food. But it's the way that food is distributed that is making
Mm.
people hungry, not the way food is produced itself. It's the way that market mechanisms are involved in ordering who gets to eat and who remains hungry. And this you can see in a place like Gadarif State. Gadarif State is a part of eastern Sudan. It lies in a very clay dense plain in eastern Sudan. It's very rich in terms of soil. And it is Sudan's granary, if you like. It's where most of Sudan's sorghum, which is the staple cereal in Sudan's countryside, is produced. And most people in Gadarif are farmers or agricultural laborers. And Gadarif is paradoxically a very, very hungry place. So not only one third, but up to one half of people in Gadarif don't get enough to eat. And the reason is that they can't afford the sorghum that they themselves contribute to producing or produce. So agricultural labor on farms in Gadarif don't get enough money to buy the sorghum that they themselves produce. That's simply put.
Wow,
And
that's wild.
and if you consider these things, you see how a new liberal agenda, how much mess a new liberal agenda can cause in a place in a place far away place from the US like Sudan. It means hunger. It means um, stunting. It means poor child growth. It also means war because it feeds into the formation of militias, and it also feeds into criminality because criminality is a one from being a petty criminal. It's probably better to be a militia member. You can probably make more if you're not if you join a militia, and it means that a lot of young people don't have any opportunities. And in a way, this is a crushing defeat for all, not defeat, but it sort of exposes the the duplicity um, of Western countries when they talk about democratization in a place like Sudan. Now, democratization in a place like Sudan involves pulling Sudan out of its financial crisis. That financial crisis was precipitated by a severe debt crisis that goes back to the 70s. Had the Western nations any interest in seeing Sudan move one step ahead, they would have relieved it of its debt and provided it and stopped sort of strong arming it into neoliberal reforms that really pushed the way the economy works and allowed the country to think through its structures and not force it into a straitjacket that it is not fit for, a straitjacket of entrepreneurship and the promotion of a consumption values and a consumption culture for which the country is not prepared.
No, that's really well said. I just wanted to add, I mean, a lot of these policies that we're seeing now are coming at the advice of, and by advice, I just mean basically forced on by the IMF, right? Because of the debt that you're talking about. And we see this happen to so many developing countries. But in particular, just to build off what you're saying, we've seen the IMF kind of pushing Sudan into removing these subsidies. Can you talk a little bit about the subsidies that have been removed? And was this because of outside pressure, which I guess I kind of answered that. Although I'm sure there's local elites that are excited to do that as well, but also the effects on people from the removal of these subsidies. Please go ahead.
I mean, the argument to the IMF for the removal of subsidies was that these subsidies were benefiting the rich.
Right.
Because they were equally offered across the spectrum. The subsidy system was a feature of a malfunctioning economic system. I'm not defending the subsidy system in itself. Removing the subsidies made people poorer because it also exposed people who couldn't buy their daily bread to a severe sort of price crisis with severe inflationary pressures, and they couldn't cover that. What the IMF did not offer at all, did not consider, is that how not only to reform the subsidy system, but how to think otherwise about the economy. And an element of that is, if you want to keep the subsidies, if you want to remove the subsidies, what do you offer people instead? In my mind, the answer to the subsidy system is free education and free healthcare. That would take severe pressure on households, and you could glean that from household surveys where people explain what they spend their money on. They spend it on food largely, but the second item on the list is healthcare and education, especially for people who have children. And healthcare in Sudan has been completely privatized, and it's a terribly expensive thing. And there is no truly functional insurance system to cover these costs. And it's on the open market, just like Sudan's fuel today. So had there been any interest in the well-being of the population, you would, in addition to, you might well remove the subsidy system, because in a way it was symptomatic of something malfunctional, symptomatic of the way that you were getting profits from the countryside and pushing them into the city to fund a mal-aligned political system. But to make it work for people, removing the subsidy should have been coupled or would have been replaced by free healthcare and free education. And that was a demand that you could hear of every household, is that this is what makes people sort of stay awake at night, is that they don't know how will they care for their elderly mother or for their elderly father, how will they buy medicine? And these are terribly expensive items because they've been fully privatized, including primary healthcare, including things like vaccination campaign or basic health services for under 5-year-olds. You just can't get that very easily anymore. It's difficult. It's not available. And this means that you have sort of expenditures on the household that are terribly high. The same applies for education. Now, education has been privatized already beginning in the 90s. There are still government-funded schools, but they're so terribly underfunded that it's a complete waste of time to put your child in a school unless you just want him to. Maybe the child would come out from 4 years education with basic reading, writing skills and arithmetic, but this child would not make it very far in the job market. You need to spend a lot more on that child at the private level to make her competitive, especially knowing that these children are made for export. Families invest in their children because they want them to go somewhere to earn more money and to send it back home. So labor in itself an export item, and these are families' insurance system against bad days, is that you have a son or a daughter abroad who can sort of maintain your consumption levels or make sure that you get adequate healthcare in your old age. And
Right.
it is these calculations that households make, including middle class households, about the way they deal with children or they invest in children. And it's not even strange. Even Sudan's militias are now exported. You probably know that.
Yeah, I want to get to that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the militia forces are fighting in places as disparate as Yemen,
Hmm.
and they've been fighting in Libya, where youngsters from Sudan, teenagers, are killing other teenagers on the Yemeni mountains.
It's horrible. And I do want to get into that a little bit more, but I'm curious. I mean, based on everything you just said, did the coup lead to economic suffering for the population?
Well, I mean, it's not just the coup. It's policies that have been ongoing since 1978 under different governments. It's not.
Hmm.
I wouldn't just home it on the coup. Of course, the coup meant that some of Sudan's international relations deteriorated. Some Western countries were not willing to pay the man in uniform or thought that that was a bad idea. But the policies in themselves have been in action almost since they began sort of in the late 80s. A reordering of economic system in Sudan, and the high point was the 90s during a big wave of privatization that was coupled with the subsidy system. That was a way of sort of paying people off for privatization. And then the interim government, the transitional government, took away the subsidy system and maintained privatization. So people are not getting much out of anything, to be honest.
Yeah.
And so it's not. I think it would be misleading to just home in on the coup. Of course, the
Right.
coup is a feature of the political disorder in the country, but the underlying reasons for that disorder are to be found in the way the country's economy works. And the way it has been restructured since the 80s is along the lines that you term neoliberalization.
So 2019, and you alluded to this before, but 2019 was not Sudan's first failed revolution. Not only was it not its first coup, it wasn't its first failed revolution. Can you remind the audience very briefly of what happened in 1964?
Well, 1964 was another date where also a sort of a crisis in a way precipitated a revolutionary upsurge. But 1964 was very much a revolution of Sudan's middle classes, a lot more than 2019. Of course, 2019, it is true that the middle classes were involved with the leadership, but the bulk, the foot soldiers of that insurgency, of that revolution, was really informal labor and a radicalized student sector. In 1964, it was all about people reacting to sort of what, in my mind, is Sudan's truly ancient sort of old regime. The regime built on the two big patrician parties, parties that controlled the countryside through means of religious cooptation, but also a very intricate system um, of merchants and smaller merchants, a merchant economy, if you like, a sort of merchant capitalism, and and the leadership of that patrician system was vested in two houses. 1964 was, in a large part, the reaction of the educated classes in Sudan to the interests of these two big patrician houses, and it involved mobilizing a broad section of the educated populace, the people who have been schooled, who went through the school system, and they did not understand themselves anymore as underlings of some patrician. They came into their own interest. And of course, it was the high tide of Sudan's trade union movement. And that was why it had such a strong emancipatory component. It was the moment when Sudan's women got the vote, for instance, when they entered parliament, when they could get equal pay for equal labor, at least in the formal sector. In the informal sector, of course, things remained as they were, and domestic labor remained completely exploited. And it is a contradiction of many places, not only Sudan. The emancipation of some women takes place at the expense of the continuous exploitation of others. And in Sudan, that was essentially the relationship between the emancipated, educated woman and the hyper exploited domestic labor from Sudan's periphery, which had shades of slave relations and slavery in it too. Now, I won't develop this further, but the point is, it was a moment when people were sort of aspired to a modernity, if you like, and where the trade union movement, because of the large trade state-owned sector or state-controlled sector, was in a position to bring state functioning to a halt, because the cotton economy meant that you had a lot of people employed in the state sector to control that cotton, to sort of to sell it, to market it, to make sure that farmers were planting cotton the right way, because it's an imported crop that people didn't really know. To make sure that so there was an army of agricultural inspectors, an army of bureaucrats who were counting the cotton, making sure they're getting every pence, and so on. And this system could be, and of course there was a transport system for cotton that relied on the railway from Sudan's central rainlands in Jazeera to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. And this meant also that state employees, including people in the railways or people in the Jazeera scheme where cotton was planted, or even bureaucrats in the finance ministries or the Ministry of Trade, had the power and the ability to bring the economy to a halt by sort of stopping the cotton production and export system. And that was a time when Sudan's educated classes, Sudan's state employees, had so much political muscle that they could define who sits in the palace on the Nile, if you like.
Well, on that particular note, since we're talking about revolutions or failed revolutions or whatnot, I'm just curious your take on this, because whether it's the so-called Arab Spring or the October 2019 uprisings that we saw in Lebanon or Iraq, or 2014 in Ukraine, if you want to call that an uprising or a coup or whatever. Either way, there is this kind of similar phenomenon we see in around the world. I think it's kind of a global trend of uprisings, but without necessarily like revolutionaries, or maybe without leading to real change is the better way to put it. And so I'm curious, your thoughts on this, if it's a lack of ideology or perhaps a lack of organization. What do you think it is that is behind this trend that we see of, these sort of failed uprisings where ultimately things stay the same?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably easy to say failed, but it's probably very difficult to make.
Maybe I'm being too mean. Yeah, maybe I'm being too mean.
It's probably no, of course, one has to admit they haven't reached their objectives, or at least what people thought were objectives. I think the best way to think about them would be to start, in my mind, with the mother of all revolutions in the current era, the Egyptian revolution of 2011. And you had a very swift counterattack, a very swift counter-revolution, which today has almost erased even the memory of 2011, January. And you had a popular movement that relied very much on informal labor. There was organized labor in the protests of 2011. And you had these unsatisfied middle classes in it. You had this mix of unsatisfied middle class that saw their incomes deteriorate, their purchasing power fall, their ability to secure a good life deteriorate. And they were also aspiring to a notion of freedoms and rights that was coming from places like the US or the UK and so on, which are all legitimate objectives. And you had people in the labor world who were sort of in many ways fighting a lost cause. They wanted to maintain jobs at the time where jobs were being shed off. They wanted to maintain a trade union culture at the time when that was almost not anymore on the table. And they were sort of subjected to a severe neoliberal onslaught. And you had a new forms of labor, informal labor, people who were making a living in the crevices and the dark alleys of the cities, if you like, by ways and means that are not all legal, but in any case, that's how they're making a living. And these elements combined, and there wasn't a leadership, an organic leadership coming out of them. They were many and multiple leaderships, and there wasn't an ideology, because the last big answer to the world came from communism. And that's a word you can't really use in everyday life anymore. And people have no idea what is the alternative to a current system of capitalist exploitation. There is no obvious programmatic alternative on the table. That's why it's probably asking too much if the cleverest mind in the world have no idea what would be an alternative. It's a
Yeah,
bit too
that's a good
much
point.
to ask some young kids in a place like Khartoum
Yeah,
or
there is this
Cairo
kind of yeah, there
to
is this
work
kind
out
of like
an economic system to replace capitalism,
right.
because ultimately that's the wall they're striking at. It's
Yeah.
the manifestations of that capitalism, of the way capitalism works in a place like Sudan, is what you see. The manifestations of capitalism in Sudan is, or capitalist penetration in a peripheral place like Sudan, is hunger, is stunting, is
Yeah.
crime, is informality. That's how capitalism works in this place, because it only needs a cheap commodity from here. It needs raw material and nothing more, and everything else can be laid to waste. So I'm not sure if it's even neoliberalism; it's just capitalism. I mean,
Yeah.
I know people
That's a
like
good
that word,
point.
and
No,
it's
no,
sort
no,
of
it's true though, and it's there is this kind of like hegemony of capitalism culturally, at least around the world. And you're right, there isn't an alternative that has any sort of popularity or sticks in anyone's minds. And at the end of the day, you also have, and I don't know how much this applies to Sudan. I imagine it does to some degree, but in a lot of these places, I can at least speak from my experience in Lebanon, where I live, is whenever there is any potential or whenever there is anger that comes in the form of an uprising against symptoms of capitalism, very quickly you have these Western funded NGOs that jump in and try to, guide people in a certain direction so that they're not talking about capitalism. They're blaming everything on local issues. Whereas, of course, local issues, local policies are a problem, but they're also connected to international, capital. But yeah, it kind of removes the issue of capitalism from the language that people use and directs them in a different place. I don't know if that's the case again for Sudan. I imagine there's an
that's very,
NGO
very true.
infrastructure that exists there as well that does
That's
something
very, very
similar.
true. Part of the problem of the transitional government, that what you call the civilians who took place after
Mm.
Bashir was removed, was that they were they were put up against the wall. They had to answer the question how to fix this country. The answer they had was essentially Bashir's answer without Bashir. The answer they had was remove the subsidies, reform the currency system, float the currency, and expand the market. This meant that more people were going hungry, more people could not afford healthcare, more people were not getting much out of their revolution. This meant also that people were unhappy and unsatisfied with the transitional government. They didn't give it sufficient political support. So when the winds blew in the other direction, many of these politicians were left alone, because the revolution, if you like, didn't pay dividends. It didn't pay up. It didn't put food on people's tables. And the politicians of the civilian government, like many other people, I mean, some of them were excited about unleashing, um, freeing capitalist forces in Sudan. They thought that would be the answer. Is that you need to liberate market forces enough as to make it work, on the assumption that what they already had was dysfunctional capitalism, on the
Right.
assumption that the problem was that Bashir's capitalism was not good capitalism. It was bad because it involved militias and it involved guns. But isn't that primitive accumulation? It had to involve guns and militias. The war in the sacrificial war in Darfur that went on for 10 years was part of what the market system did to Darfur. It was part of what was necessary to free land of the peasantry and to get people off places where gold sits underground, to get rid of ancient land titles, to get rid of communal ways of thinking about land relations. You had to have a war. The war was a symptom of in my mind, what the market system was doing to a place that lived for a long part of its history on on sort of on sustenance, a system that was not based on.
Well, I'm glad you actually raised Darfur because I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that. In 2014, Sudan launched this counterinsurgency campaign and crushed the Darfur uprising that had begun back, I think, in 2003. So, just to build on what you're saying, I mean, can you briefly explain why this uprising occurred and how it was suppressed? And I think it's really interesting you frame it in the context of pushing people off land.
I mean, Darfur is a place where sort of Sudan's environmental crisis also comes to the fore, because it is a place where the Sahel meets the savannah, if you like. It's a place where the drier parts of the Sahelian belt meet the more richer savannah. It also includes pockets of agricultural production where people rely on their livelihood on working the land, as compared to broad areas, vast areas where transhuman sort of pastoralists move across environmental zones and climate zones to keep their livestock alive. And the environmental pressure on these very sort of difficult, at times sort of precarious relations between farmers and between pastoralists were thrown out of balance by the drought, the long dry, the long drought that happened in the 1980s, and also by the militarization of the consequences of the drought, because the drought produced people who had lost their livestock. It also produced people who had no more access to livelihood. And the gun became a way of making a livelihood, especially in the Libyan war. And the Libyan war attracted fighters from Darfur who made a buck out of it and came back home with a bit of money, and also with fighting experience. And with that fighting experience, they sought to change land relations in Darfur, because they didn't do agriculture, they depended on livestock. And they wanted everywhere to become a place for livestock. They wanted to encroach on lands that were used for agriculture. On the other hand, people who had lived on agriculture for many years were entering the export economy. They did not only produce for themselves, they were beginning to produce for the market, which means that they wanted to expand their agricultural holdings. And that friction between people who were competing for meager resources with different coping mechanisms was resolved through warfare. And the pastoralists could draw on the entire African Sahel, if you like, on a record of fighting along the African Sahel. People who were moving across national borders between places like between Darfur and Chad and Libya and Niger, people who were moving across these borders in searching for ways of making a living. And the gun became the epicenter of that. And I think the Darfur's farmers were just in many ways overwhelmed by these powerful pastoralists who had learned how to use guns. They created their own insurgencies, their own rebel movements, but these rebel movements were crushed very. I mean, it took some time to crush them, but eventually they were crushed, or they were pulled into circuits of fighting that were a far cry from what they initially intended to. They ended up fighting wars in Libya for other people, and nothing to do with their own concerns back home, or fighting a war in the Central African Republic for other commanders because they needed to make money, because the militia in itself became a form of a livelihood. War in itself became a livelihood. And the ideological motives and the ideological sort of the grievances that initiated the war were one story, but how the internal dynamics of that war were another, especially after things go on for years and years. And you can see that in a place like Afghanistan, where you can't anymore control who fights for what. And in many ways, Darfur became exactly such a place. It's not clear who fights for what. And it's not clear who's on whose sides, and people can switch sides very easily and very quickly, because fighting in itself became a business. It became a way of acquiring, of controlling trade routes, of acquiring land, of acquiring mining rights. It became a way of taxing, of forming, of sort of enforcing taxes on traders who were moving merchandise between different countries. There was a time in Darfur where every 10 kilometers you would have somebody telling you to pay something because they were taxing the trade routes. And these would be competing warlords or competing rebel armies or rebel movements would be doing this, would be forcing the population into chains of taxation, which also meant that the traditional livelihoods were decimated and people became completely dependent on foreign aid in large and inhospitable refugee and internal displacement camps in Darfur and in Chad. And these are the places where you can recruit militias. These are the places where you can find young men who could fight on any side, because these are communities that have been uprooted, that don't have a direction anymore, that have no relationship to land, that don't know how they are going to make a living, that are that don't have, where social ties have been completely distraught, and where the moral economy that binds a village in a place like Darfur or even in Lebanon is not anymore intact. That moral economy doesn't operate anymore. People are left to sort out matters by themselves, which means they could end up joining this or that militia, or it doesn't really matter anymore. You want to survive in a
highest
severe...
bidder. Yeah. You know, what has been the impact of losing South Sudan? And are there any calls at all for reunification, given how South Sudan has become essentially a failed state?
Well, I'm not sure if it's somebody... I come from northern Sudan, and I think we don't have the right to speak a single word about that. The relationship between North Sudan and South Sudan was a highly exploitative relationship. It involves a long history of slavery, of exploitation, of control, of labor exploitation, of unequal relations, and involves a lot of racism. And I understand that people would be calling for a reunion of Sudan and South Sudan from some sort of progressive anti-American position, which is fair to say, but I'm not sure if they were one at any point in time. So there was a political unity, of course, that's true, but I'm not sure if you could speak of it, if you could say more than that. And that political unity was enforced by the gun.
Of course.
And I'm not sure if you could just comment on that. Sort of off
Fair
your
enough.
head.
Fair enough.
I think it's
contentious. It's a contentious
it's
issue,
very
to say the
contentious,
least.
and I think also that, of course, in many ways, maybe that's the karma of nations. In many ways, Sudan is becoming more and more like South Sudan. The South Sudan that people mocked in 2011 as a place where militias arrive and there is no stable government and there's civil war. The Sudan that enjoyed some of that stability in its post-colonial history because it had wide peripheries that it could draw resources from, is now closer to that place than it was 10 years ago. It's
unfortunate.
Looking more and more like sort of the pure form of the pure form. If the pure form is South Sudan, then Sudan is approximating that pure form, is moving into that direction. The political parties are sort of, in a way, bankrupt. They don't have much to offer. Government is not completely, but terribly militarized. Militarization is the order of the day. Production systems are highly militarized. And the basic functions of the state, including in urban centers, are not anymore guaranteed, like maintenance of security. That looks very much like the type of problems you have in South Sudan.
Indeed. I wanted to ask you also about the issue of, Nile politics and the potential impact of the Ethiopian dam over Sudan.
I mean, there's not much science. There's a lot of politics about that and little science. It depends who you ask. So you will hear all sorts of opinions. People will tell you that's in the benefit of Sudan. Others will tell you, no, it's not in the benefit. But I think one important lesson to draw from that is, I mean, I don't understand much about dams, but I understand a bit about the history of dams in Sudan. And in Sudan, it involved a lot of displacement and a lot of destruction for local communities, a lot of lost memories and lost histories. And it didn't produce much electricity there after all. Sudan built into 2000, after the discovery of oil, it constructed a big dam on the Nile called the Merowe Dam. That was supposed to solve Sudan's electricity problem. It didn't. Sudan, I just came back from Khartoum a week ago or so. There are electricity shortages every second day. The demand for electricity is high, is increased. There was a time when, of course, the electricity production from the new dam was beneficial, and the government even reduced the price of electricity as a sort of present to the urban dwellers. Now the price of electricity is terribly high because it's on the open market. It has been liberalized, like every other item has become a commodity on the open market, and the production of electricity is not satisfactory because the dam system proved to be not the best system to produce electricity because it involves a lot of silting, and to remove that silt that clogs these dams and blocks the turbines that produce the electricity, you need to spend a lot of money maintaining them. And governments don't like spending money on maintenance. So they wait forever until the turbines sort of stop working, and then they maintain one turbine at a turn, which means that the electricity production is going down. The cost of maintaining that production is high because of the high maintenance costs. And you have this mountain of cement on the Nile instead of electricity. And so I'm not sure, I don't know much about it. I would love to understand it better if people would produce that science.
Well, just, I guess actually just, I understand like the science and the dam and stuff, but just like tangentially related to the issue of Ethiopia. I mean, there has been this Ethiopian civil war taking place, which has led to the displacement of millions of people, including across the border to Sudan. And some refugee camps have, of course, become militarized. So I'm just curious, how has the war in Ethiopia impacted Sudan, and is Sudan playing any sort of role?
Well, I'm not sure about the roles. I'm not a security geek, so I don't know about who is playing which role. But I can tell you
all
this.
We can do is speculate.
It reduced. There was an influx. Sudan has. I'm talking about. I want to say something about these refugees. Sudan has been depending on refugees from Ethiopia and Eritrea, or migrants from Ethiopia and Eritrea. The long war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and before that, the Eritrean Liberation War, as well as the Ethiopian insurgency and the milice and the TPLF against the Derg regime, was paradoxically beneficial for a place like Sudan. It meant there was a refugee crisis at the border, which was left over to the UN system to sort out. And there was a bit of pressure on food system. But it meant that you had terribly cheap labor.
Yeah.
You had people who were willing to work for terribly low wages in the vast tracts of land in Gaddarif and the arena. And a lot of Sudan's wealth that was produced in the 70s, in the 80s, and even into the 90s, throughout these long wars in Ethiopia and Eritrea, is actually taken out from the shoulders of these Ethiopian labor, the Ethiopian agricultural labor, men and women. And it is the same men and women who are also part of the sort of domestic labor system in urban centers. So people would find ways of exploiting these wars to their benefit and pushing down labor prices. It also meant that the labor price in the country remains low. And one way of doing that is through continuous wars. You always need a war to keep labor prices down, because wars produce refugees, produce displaced people, and who need an income of any sort, and they would accept very low labor costs.
There's also, I'll add, I don't know if this is the case for Sudan, but I know that with Lebanon, there's so many Syrian refugees in Lebanon over the years, and part of the country's income became receiving money to host refugees. Yeah. I'm not sure if that was the case for Sudan, but that can also...
Of course, part of the country's income under Bashir, and probably, I don't know if it continues until today, was coming from the so-called Khartoum process,
Mm.
So the European Union was paying Sudan to keep refugees away from its borders.
Right.
So in a way, Sudan was acting like a policeman in the Sahara against migrants coming from places like Eritrea and Ethiopia who are moving northwards to cross the Mediterranean. If they manage to cross it, most of them end up in the deep sea.
Yeah.
And of course, Sudan was using at the beginning of the war, not at the beginning, but at the escalation of the Tigrayan war, Sudan was using the argument of, oh, we're hosting so many refugees in eastern Sudan, to argue for more money coming in from the UN system.
Right.
I mean, I don't mind money coming in from the UN system; they should pay, but I'm not sure if they're paying it
right, because then it just ends up ending up in people's bank accounts. I mean, honestly, that's what ends up happening. Well, I wanted to ask you about a little bit of a different aspect here, and that's, Omar Bashir had at one point abandoned Iran and supported the Saudi war in Yemen and sent, as you mentioned, Sudanese fighters to fight there. But despite that, he was still deposed. So why do you think this wasn't enough to keep him in power? In a way, it kind of reminds me of Gaddafi reconciling with the West, but still getting overthrown.
I mean, it wasn't only that. It was beginning with the secession of South Sudan. I mean, at the secession of South Sudan in 2011, at the independence, part of the bargain that was understood by Sudanese officials is that the Americans promised, or were said to have promised, if Sudan would let South Sudan go, Sudan would be lifted off the state supporters of terrorism list. The sanctions would be lifted. Sudan's relations with the West would improve. Sudan would be brought in from the cold, as it were. That didn't happen. Instead, a war blew up in Darfur that was badly managed by Khartoum. It sort of turned completely out of control, and it was very impossible for any observer to sort of call for improved relations between Sudan and the West. It took 10 years for talk about that improvement to come back. After essentially the war in Darfur was finished to the benefit of Khartoum, and the insurgency was defeated, and all these people were killed. There was a renewed discussion of improving relations with Sudan. And indeed, the Obama administration lifted some of the sanctions on Sudan, and there was an opening of discussions. At that point in time, there were also improved relations with the Saudis, and Sudan moved away from the Iranian axis towards the Saudi axis. But remember, what brought down Bashir essentially was his incapability to feed the urban population. He wasn't capable of managing the urban crisis. He didn't have enough money. He went out shopping for money, which he did in 2013, and he got some money at that time from the Qataris. He went out shopping for money again shortly before his terminal crisis. But he was a man into his 70s, and he had a big competitor that he had brought into the house. He had brought in the leader of this militia into Khartoum, close to the palace, somebody who was directly involved in sending young men to fight the Yemeni war. And it was in the interest of the Saudis and probably the Emiratis to get somebody
they can't fight their own wars, that's for sure.
Like this young man who was willing to sort of ship men and ship fighters and ship livestock to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Dubai at a low cost, and that's something you don't get every day. Yeah. And I think just Bashir played out all his hands he had, because it also became, the environment in the region became very difficult to play this side against that side. He had done all that already. He had outwitted his sort of regional players for ages. He had survived long enough. 30 years is not a short period of time. And I think he was at the end of anything that could be even remotely believable. Even the turn away from the Iranians toward the Saudis. The Saudis wanted a clamp down on the Muslim Brotherhood. They wanted him to dissolve his own ruling party. And that was something that he couldn't deliver. That was not technically possible. It would have meant taking the rug under his own feet if he would defeat the very Islamists who maintained the system according to which he ruled.
Yeah. Sudan was a pariah state in recent memory, at least in the way it was depicted around the world, but was in fact a large recipient of US military aid in the 70s and 80s. And then after the 2019 coup overthrowing Bashir, this general Burhan quickly reached out to Israel, as we alluded to earlier. I wanted to get into this a little bit more. Was this his initiative, or was this a result of U.S. pressure? And is Sudan, becoming part of the pro-Israel, pro-America regional security architecture?
I'm not sure if it's becoming. I think it is somehow. It is.
Already
I mean,
is.
I mean that whether he did this sort of, where the motivation comes from, in my mind, is that, like many autocrats in the region, these men in uniform look up to the Israeli army. That is the ideal of government in the region. The ideal of government is that you have such a capable security system that has the ability to crush an entire people for 50 years continuously. That level of security control is, nobody in the region has that apart from the Israeli army. And I think that's what many of these men look up to. Sudan looked up to the U.S. Army in the 70s. It sent officers to train in the U.S. It was a recipient of U.S. military aid, generous military aid. It took part in joint operations with the U.S. and the Egyptian military. Operation Bright Star, it was called, and these operations still continue. After 2018-19, Sudan came back came back to that world, not to the full, because of the mismanagement of the military. The military hasn't really pulled it. It's not a very successful counter-revolution. I mean, it is a counter-revolution, but it's not very successful. You talked about failed revolutions. You might as well talk about failed counter-revolutions. I mean, he pulled off a coup, but he can't consolidate power in his hands yet. He hasn't crushed the popular movement yet. He hasn't ruled with the iron fist yet. And he's finding difficulties doing that because the security apparatus is not functioning the way he wants it to function, because international relations will not allow that too much, and because he has a hesitant hand. And of course, there is the option that the Americans are dangling all the time, is these continuous and endless talks. He hasn't pulled off a CC plot. That hasn't happened in Sudan yet. To pull off a CC plot, you need an intact security apparatus.
Right.
And that's something he hasn't been able to mend yet, to work as a single force. And he has absolutely no ideological motif inside his operation. Even Sisi, despite all his idiocy, has some sort of ideological motif inside of it, something around Egyptian nationalism. Even that is not working in Sudan today. So the notion that notion of Sudanese nationalism that might come from the military is not very much marketable, because Sisi could say, I killed the Muslim Brotherhoods, these were the bad guys. Burhan killed everybody. And in June 2019, it's very difficult for him to claim to have attacked the enemy. And it's very difficult to lay the blame at the hands of the Muslim Brotherhoods alone. And people are coming to the idea that, well, the Muslim Brotherhoods are essentially a major problem, but the military is also a problem. The way the military operates is also a problem. Whether that is because of the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhoods or because of its own intrinsic institutional interest. And it is these sorts of insights that are partially coming from the Egyptian experience that make it difficult for somebody like Burhan to complete his counter-revolution, because people have the lessons of Egypt in mind, and they keep throwing his offers back at his face. And it's making it politically difficult for him to pull off an entire round. There is significant international support for some sort of arrangement that involves what you call the civilian leaders and the military in some sort of expanded compromise. But they haven't pulled it off yet, because there are still young women and men who are willing to continue protesting on the streets and risk their lives under sniper fire, and who are learning to talk a different language. They might not succeed. They might be crushed and defeated like the Egyptian revolutionaries of 2011. But that potential, that possibility, is at the heart of what they're imagining. It's also providing a new way of thinking about politics, or considering what options they might have. And that should make sort of your listeners also think about not only the failures of revolution, but the failures of counter-revolutionaries
Right.
who are not good dictators. I mean, a good dictator is like
You can't say too much more, else if there's a dictator watching, he might be taking notes and being like, "What am I doing wrong?" No, but no, that's a very good point. And I really do appreciate your time here. I just have one more question I wanted to ask you. You talked a bit about hunger, both in the countryside as well as in the urban areas. But hunger in the countryside especially has increased since 2019. Why is that? And why is there this history of famines in Sudan?
That's because the countryside produces for urban consumption. The countryside produces for a market system that relies on import, and the countryside produces raw products that are directly shipped to Port Sudan, to somewhere in the UK or the US or God knows where, or to the Arab Gulf. And it is the intermediaries who are cutting off the profits. So the producers end up, which are the majority of the rural population, end up with very little money, as opposed to the traders, the people who stand in between, who to produce, who sort of constitute the linkages between the export market and the production system. It is that linkage where the money is made. These chains of internal trade and external trade. And these are very busy places, very busy chains. You've got many intermediaries, people who are sort of making a buck out of each step forward in the chain, and including, of course, the big exporters with the suits and ties, and the militia soldier who's making sure that you're paying your taxes along the road, and it is that system is what keeps people poor in the countryside, because they don't get much out of what they produce by their own hands. And I think the example of agricultural labor in a place like Gadaref is probably the best, where people produce sorghum for the entire country, even for Ethiopia and Eritrea, for export market, but they can't afford to buy it themselves, because what they're getting as a wage for their own labor is just too little. It's not even a sufficient living wage. And that just goes a long way to explaining the labor theory of value that some theoreticians already discredit. And a place like Sudan would provide good evidence for these theoretical considerations. It will sort of open up capitalism to scrutiny again, because you see it in actual operation, with very little of the ideological and the technical sort of games that are played to hide its true nature, its exploitative nature.
Well, Magdi, I really appreciate you joining me for this long to discuss all things related to Sudan. Can you let our listeners and viewers know where they can find your work?
That's a good question. Some of it is published by the Rift Valley Institute, and but most of those links to most of what I've written, you can find on a blog called Still Sudan, .blogspot.com. And there are other scattered pieces in Arabic that you would have to make a greater effort to find, but very obscure things.
And I saw that you also are published by Middle East Eye every so
often
as well.
There are several pieces published by Middle East Eye, more of a sort of political nature, and they are you can find it on the Royal, not the Royal, was it Rope? The Review of African Economy has published 2 pieces, and you'll also find something on the Spectre Journal, which is a new US. It names itself Marxist Journal. It's interesting that the journal would name itself Marxist.
It's becoming okay in the US to
I suppose so. Yes,
these days. Well, I want to right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me and breaking all this down for us.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for listening to all that I've tried to say.